I watched my daughter's small fingers tug at the golden ribbon, her curls bouncing as she leaned over the gift box. The paper shimmered under the morning light spilling through our living room window, soft, honey-colored, almost too warm for December. It was from him, her grandfather. I hadn't expected it. The package had arrived yesterday, wrapped neatly, with his familiar handwriting on the tag, "To Lily from Grandpa." My chest tightened at the sight of those letters. I hadn't seen them in years. "Mommy, can I open it now?" Lily's voice chimed, bright and unguarded, as if the world had never taught her what disappointment felt like. "Go ahead, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. My voice sounded steady, too steady for the way my stomach twisted. She tore through the wrapping, pulled open the lid, and froze. Inside, nothing. Just a hollow box lined with silver paper. Her eyes lifted to mine, puzzled. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't decide whether to protect her heart or let her see the truth about him. Before I could find words, she looked toward the doorway, where my father stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets, as if he'd been holding his breath. Then, in her soft, innocent voice, Lily said, "It's okay, Grandpa. I have one for you too." And in that second, that single, unexpected sentence, his face went pale. The air shifted. Something unspoken cracked wide open between us, and I felt the ground tilt under years of silence. It's strange how one sentence can shatter the walls you've spent years building. When Lily spoke, I saw him, not as the gray-haired man standing in my doorway, but as the same cold, immovable father I left behind more than a decade ago. Back then, I was 22, standing in this very house with a suitcase by the door and tears I refused to let fall. I can still hear his voice echoing through the hall, calm, cutting, final. "You're throwing your life away, Emma." He didn't shout. My father never needed to. His disappointment was louder than anger could ever be. "I'm not," I whispered, clutching the strap of my bag. "I'm choosing it." He looked at me like I'd spoken another language. Maybe I had. The language of independence, of choosing love over legacy. He'd built everything on control, his business, our image, his family. I was supposed to follow that blueprint. Perfect daughter. Perfect grades. Perfect silence. But I'd fallen in love with someone who didn't fit his mold, a dreamer with paint-stained hands and laughter that filled every empty space he'd left in me. My father called him a mistake. When I refused to walk away, he drew the line. "If you leave with him," he said, "don't come back." The air had felt sharp that night. The winter wind howled through the open door, but the cold inside me was worse. I remember my mother's eyes, full of tears she wasn't allowed to shed. She pressed something small into my palm before I walked out. A tiny silver locket, simple and unadorned. "It's empty," she whispered, "but one day, you'll fill it with something that matters." I didn't understand then. I do now. That locket became my secret, the one thing I kept when everything else fell apart. Through the years that followed, losing my mother, raising Lily alone after her father passed, it stayed with me. Empty, just like the space where my father should have been. When I finally stopped hoping he'd call, I told myself I was over it, that I didn't need him, that I'd built a life of my own. And yet, standing here today, watching him flinch at my daughter's words, I realize the past never really leaves you. It waits quietly, wrapped in silver paper, until the moment it's unboxed again. After I left home, life didn't unfold like a movie. There were no grand miracles, just quiet, stubborn survival. The first apartment I rented was the size of my father's study, a single window, a mattress on the floor, and a heater that worked only when it felt generous. I used to stare at that window every night, watching the city lights blur through my tears, and whisper to myself, "You chose this, Emma. Make it mean something." Ethan, the man my father called a mistake, was kind but restless. He painted murals that no one paid for, wrote poetry on the backs of grocery receipts, and believed in beauty even when we could barely afford bread. For a while, that belief was enough. But dreams are fragile when rent is due. He got sick before our daughter was born, A quiet illness that came without warning and left me alone faster than I could understand what widow even meant. Lily was 3 months old when I stood in line for my first job interview, wearing my only blazer, the one I'd bought secondhand and ironed with trembling hands. The manager, a woman named Carla, looked at me and saw something no one had before. Strength. Desperation, maybe. But mostly potential. She hired me on the spot. I started as an assistant at a small design firm, making coffee runs and typing proposals until my fingers cramped. But I watched, learned every detail, every client quirk, every strategy. At night, after Lily was asleep, I'd sketch quietly on scraps of paper, ideas swirling faster than exhaustion could keep up. Within 2 years, I was designing full campaigns, clean, bold, full of color and emotion. The kind of work Ethan would have loved. Carla noticed. One evening, she leaned against my desk, a knowing smile on her face. "You've got it, Emma," she said. "That thing people spend years trying to fake. Heart." Her belief lit a fire that never went out. By the time I was 30, I'd launched my own studio, Lumen Designs. A name that meant light, because that's what I'd been chasing since the night I walked away from my father's house. I didn't post much about it. No flashy updates, no humble brags on social media. I didn't need to prove anything, especially not to him. My world became small but full. Lily, my team, my work, the quiet hum of purpose. Sometimes, though, when I'd see a father and daughter at a cafe, her tiny hand wrapped around his finger, a part of me would ache. The little girl in me still wanted that kind of warmth. But instead of reaching out, I poured it into my daughter. Every bedtime story, every note in her lunchbox, every whispered, "I'm proud of you," was a promise that she'd never doubt her worth, the way I once did. I thought I'd buried my past completely. But the truth is, you can't bury something that still beats inside you. And when my father's gift arrived, wrapped in gold and silence, it was as if the past itself had knocked on my door, asking to be seen again. It had been years since I'd seen my father in person. When he showed up that morning, it felt like time paused, like the air itself didn't know what to do with him. He looked smaller than I remembered. The lines on his face had deepened, but his posture was the same, upright, proud, rehearsed. He stood by the doorway, clutching his coat as if he might change his mind at any second. "Emma," he said quietly. "Dad." The word came out before I could stop it, strange, foreign, like a name I hadn't spoken in another lifetime. We hadn't spoken since my mother's funeral. Even then, his words had been brief, mechanical. Grief hadn't softened him. It had hardened him further. He'd called 2 weeks ago, his voice rough, with something that almost sounded like regret. Said he wanted to see his granddaughter. I'd agreed, not for him, but for Lily. She deserved to know where she came from, even if I wasn't sure he deserved her. Now, he stood in my living room, surrounded by pieces of a life he knew nothing about. Framed photos of Lily, her drawings taped on the fridge, the faint scent of coffee and vanilla candles. Everything ordinary, except for the tension pulsing between us. "Your home is lovely," he said, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for cracks. "It's ours," I replied simply. He nodded, then looked toward the Christmas tree, small, but warm with soft lights. Beneath it sat the gift he'd brought, wrapped in gold paper that shimmered under the glow. When Lily opened it, I saw the moment everything inside me clenched. An empty box. Perfectly wrapped, perfectly hollow. For a heartbeat, no one moved. I felt my throat tighten, words pressing against it like glass. He'd always been the man who gave things that looked valuable but meant nothing. Apologies wrapped in advice, affection coded in control. And now, even this gift, it was him all over again. I reached for Lily, ready to soften the blow, but she looked up with that radiant, innocent smile that could disarm the coldest heart. "It's okay, Grandpa," she said softly. "I have one for you too." She ran to her room and came back clutching something small, the silver locket my mother had given me. I'd passed it to Lily months ago, telling her it once belonged to her grandmother. She held it out with both hands. "It's empty," she said proudly. But Mommy said empty things mean you still have space to fill. My father's face went white. His fingers trembled as he looked down at the locket, his late wife's locket, then back at me. I didn't know she still had that, he whispered. His voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw something human flicker behind his eyes. Guilt. Memory. Maybe even love. I swallowed hard. She kept it, Dad. Through everything. I guess she believed one day it might mean something again. The silence stretched. The ticking clock filled the room like a heartbeat. He finally looked at me, really looked. Emma, he said, his voice breaking around the edges. I didn't mean for. But I stopped him. Gently. Yes, you did. Maybe not in words, but in the way you chose pride over people. Control over connection. I'm not that girl anymore, Dad. And she, I gestured toward Lily, deserves more than empty boxes. His eyes glistened. He nodded, as if absorbing every word like a slow punishment he'd long avoided. And in that fragile, quiet moment, standing between my daughter's light and my father's regret, I realized something. Sometimes, forgiveness doesn't arrive as a hug or apology. Sometimes, it comes in the shape of a child's gift, an invitation to begin again. The silence after Lily's words hung heavy, not uncomfortable, but sacred, like the air after a storm finally breaks. My father sat on the edge of the couch, the silver locket resting in his trembling hand. For once, the man who had always filled every room with authority had nothing left to say. I stood across from him, watching. Years of hurt, disappointment, and longing tangled in my chest, fighting for space. But beneath it all, there was clarity. For the first time, I wasn't that frightened girl begging for approval. I was a woman who'd built her life brick by brick, without him. Dad, I began quietly. You don't get to walk back in and pretend nothing happened. He flinched, but didn't interrupt. I could see the remorse etched into the lines on his face. Still, I didn't let it sway me, not yet. When you shut the door on me all those years ago, I continued, you didn't just lose a daughter. You lost birthdays, laughter, first words, scraped knees. You lost Lily's first steps. Her first word was light. Can you believe that? He blinked, his eyes glassy. I didn't know, he murmured. Of course you didn't, I said softly. You weren't there. He bowed his head, his voice breaking. I thought I was protecting you, Emma. I thought he wasn't good enough. Maybe he wasn't, I interrupted gently, but that was my choice to make. You taught me how to stand tall, but you never taught me how to stand alone. I had to learn that by surviving without you. He looked up then, meeting my gaze. For once, there was no defense, no pride. Just quiet acceptance. I can't change what I did, he said, his voice shaking. But I want to try, if you'll let me. I exhaled slowly, glancing at Lily, who was now busy drawing hearts on the wrapping paper. She didn't know she'd just mended something generations deep. You can be in her life, I said at last, my voice steady. But there are conditions. He looked startled, almost afraid. Conditions? Yes. I took a step closer, lowering my tone but not my resolve. If you want to be her grandfather, you have to show up, not just with gifts, but with time. No more half-efforts or apologies disguised as boxes. She needs presence, not perfection. He nodded quickly, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. And one more thing, I added. You don't get to rewrite the past. We're not erasing what happened. We're rebuilding from it, honestly. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. That's fair. Something inside me softened then, not forgiveness yet, but the beginning of it. The power had shifted, yes, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't about control or revenge. It was about truth. Lily looked up just then, grinning. Grandpa, can you help me draw? He hesitated, then nodded, setting the locket carefully on the table and kneeling beside her. As he picked up a crayon, his hands still shook, but his smile was real. I watched them together. The man who once turned away, and the little girl who'd unknowingly turned him back toward love. Maybe this was what healing looked like. Messy, slow, but possible. It's been 3 months since that morning, the day my daughter gave an empty locket to a man who had spent years trying to fill his life with everything but love. I didn't expect much after that. Words are easy, promises even easier. But my father surprised me. He started small. A phone call every Sunday. Then a visit after Lily's dance class, standing shyly by the doorway with paper cups of hot chocolate in his hands. She'd run to him, excited, her laughter echoing through the house like music I hadn't heard in years. He never came empty-handed again, not with gifts, but with time. He helped her build birdhouses in the backyard, taught her how to sand the wood smooth, how to hold a hammer without fear. The first one she painted was bright yellow, and she proudly wrote on it in uneven letters, "For Grandpa." I watched them from the kitchen window, the locket now hanging by the birdhouse, glinting in the sunlight. It wasn't empty anymore. Inside it, Lily had placed a photo of the two of them smiling, sawdust in their hair. Some nights, after she's asleep, I still think about the years I lost, the birthdays missed, the silences that stretched like oceans. But grief has softened around the edges. I know now that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing peace over proof. About accepting that some people don't learn love until they almost lose it. Last week, my father handed me something, a small box, wrapped in plain brown paper. "I wanted to give this to you," he said. Inside was a key. "To your mother's art studio," he explained quietly. "I kept it locked all these years. I think she'd want you to have it." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't about the room. It was what it meant. A door reopening. That night, after Lily went to bed, I stood in that old studio. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and dust, the light soft and golden. On the shelf, I found one last unfinished canvas, a mother, a daughter, and a small silver locket at the center. I traced the brushstrokes, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. In the end, I realized the gift he gave me was never really empty. It was a mirror, waiting for us to fill it with meaning. And as I closed the studio door, I whispered the words that had taken me a lifetime to find. Sometimes, the emptiest gifts carry the heaviest truths. And the bravest thing a heart can do is open again. Bottom of form.